Hello, and welcome to Day by Day True Crime Stories, the podcast where we examine a different crime or justice milestone from this day in history. I'm your host, Kona Gallagher, and today is March 13th. On this day in 2020, it was just after midnight when 26-year-old Breonna Taylor and her boyfriend, Kenneth Walker, were in bed in their apartment in Louisville, Kentucky. It had been a quiet, peaceful night. It was just a normal evening for a young couple winding down. But then came a knock on the door. And moments later, the stillness of the night was shattered by gunfire. When police forced their way inside, an exchange of bullets followed. And by the time the shooting stopped, Breonna Taylor lay dying on the floor of her own home. The officers were there on a controversial narcotics warrant, one that would later be questioned, investigated, and revealed to have been based on false information. Breonna Taylor's death was not just a tragedy, it became a turning point in the fight for justice reform, police accountability, and the end of no-knock warrants. Today, we'll examine the events leading up to her death, the legal fallout, and how her case changed policing in America. Let's get started. Breonna Taylor was not a criminal. She worked as an EMT and had dreams of becoming a nurse. Those who knew her described her as compassionate, and she was deeply loved by her family and friends. So why did police storm into her home that night? The warrant that led officers to her apartment was part of a larger narcotics investigation that was centered on Jamarcus Glover, an ex-boyfriend of Breonna's. Police suspected that Glover was operating a drug trafficking ring, and they believed that he had been using Breonna's apartment to receive packages related to drug activity. But there was a huge flaw in that theory. Glover had already been arrested hours before the raid, so there was no way that he was in that apartment that night. And later, postal inspectors confirmed that there were no suspicious packages being delivered to Breonna's home. Beyond that, by March 13th, 2020, Breonna had already distanced herself from Glover. He was her ex, and he was her ex for a reason. She was not involved in any drug operation or anything having to do with him. Still, the Louisville Metro Police Department secured a search warrant for her apartment. At first, it was classified as a no-knock warrant, which meant that officers could enter without announcing themselves. But by the time of the raid, the order had reportedly been changed to a knock and announce warrant. But did officers actually knock and announce themselves? That's where the conflicting accounts began. It was 12:40 a.m. when officers Jonathan Mattingly, Brett Hankinson, and Miles Cosgrove arrived at Breonna's apartment. They were dressed in plain clothes, meaning they did not look like police officers. Inside, Breonna and Kenneth were asleep. Then came a loud pounding on their door. Just imagine how confused and afraid they must have been. Kenneth later said that they asked multiple times who was at the door, but no one responded. Kenneth thought they were about to be victims of a home invasion, so he grabbed his legally owned firearm. Then, officers forced their way inside. In the split-second confusion when all of these people were bursting into his home, Kenneth fired a single shot, hitting Sergeant Mattingly in the leg. In response, police unleashed a hail of bullets, firing at least 32 rounds into the apartment. Breonna, who had been standing in the hallway, was hit 6 times. The bullets that killed her were fired by Officer Cosgrove, while Officer Hankinson fired blindly through a window and a glass door, spraying bullets into the apartment. Kenneth quickly realized that Breonna wasn't moving. He dialed 911 and told the dispatcher, quote, "Somebody kicked in the door and shot my girlfriend," end quote. Despite being alive after the shooting, Breonna received no medical assistance. This EMT, this person who had probably been on scenes just like this herself, received no help from anyone. The officers did not administer aid, and the paramedics had been told to leave the area before the raid for their own safety, so they weren't there to help her either. It would be more than 20 minutes before she was officially declared dead. She died slowly on the floor of her own home for absolutely no reason. In the immediate aftermath, Kenneth Walker was the one who was arrested. He was charged with attempted murder of a police officer, but he maintained that he had no idea at the time that the men who broke into his apartment were police officers. The charges against Kenneth were later dropped, thankfully, but by then the damage was already done. The community and eventually the entire nation demanded answers. Why was Breonna killed? Why did police conduct a high-risk raid based on false information? And most importantly, why was no officer immediately held accountable for her death? As these questions spread, protests erupted across the country. Breonna's name became a rallying cry for police accountability alongside cases like George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery. Despite the overwhelming public outcry, none of the officers were initially charged in Breonna's death. The only criminal charges were fired against Officer Brett Hankinson, but not for killing Breonna. Hankinson was indicted on 3 counts of wanton endangerment for recklessly firing bullets into a neighboring apartment where a family was sleeping. On September 23, 2020, Kentucky Attorney General Daniel Cameron announced that no officers would face charges for Breonna's death. He stated that the use of force was justified because Kenneth fired first. The decision ignited even more protests. Many argued that Breonna's life had been erased in the eyes of the justice system, but the case wasn't over. In August 2022, the Department of Justice charged 4 officers for crimes related to the raid, including falsifying the search warrant and obstruction of justice. One of those officers, former Detective Kelly Goodlett, pleaded guilty, admitting that police used false information to justify the raid. While she shouldn't have died, Breonna Taylor's case led to significant policy changes. In June 2020, Louisville passed Breonna's Law, a law that bans no-knock warrants in the city. Other states followed, implementing similar restrictions to hopefully prevent another tragedy like Breonna's. Her family also received a $12 million settlement, one of the largest ever in a police misconduct case. The agreement included police reforms such as wearing body cameras and stronger oversight on warrants. But for many, that's not justice. The officers who fired the fatal shots were never convicted, and Breonna is gone. Her case is yet another reminder of how far we still need to go with police reform and getting true justice for victims. Thank you for joining me on this episode of Day by Day True Crime Stories. If you found this story compelling, please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast. And be sure to join me again tomorrow as we explore another significant event in true crime history. Until then, stay safe and remember that behind every headline is a life worth remembering. Day by Day True Crime Stories is a Little Monster production.
Hey, you can do it!